Thank you, Lyndon. If I can also pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. Yes, it's a large portfolio, very large indeed. And when I'm working in the portfolio, I'm often reminded of one of those great dictums in public policy regarding the wisdom of fixing things that are not broken. And I think the converse to that dictum is also very powerful and very simple, which is if you're going to engage in reform, it's absolutely critical to identify with great precision the problems that exist with the present system. So over the last 4 years, the government has focused on the overarching problem of sustainability in the welfare system. And that problem is relatively simple to describe, very difficult to tackle, but the problem is that welfare spending was growing faster than the taxpayer's ability to pay for it. And the result of failing to deal with the sustainability problem would be the need to just continually borrow money to fund today's welfare system growth, and that approach simply loads debt onto the next generation of Australians. Now, that outcome should be absolutely unacceptable to everyone in government, because if you borrow money to fund present recurrent expenditure, you are simply forcing Australians to pay for the welfare system of their own time. Rather than us paying for the welfare system of our own time, we're forcing our children to pay for the welfare system of their time in 15 or 20 years' time, and retrospectively pay for the welfare system of our time through higher taxes. And that breaks the fundamental compact that any politician is supposed to agree with, which is that we are supposed to leave things in better shape than when we inherited them. So that outcome should be absolutely unacceptable. So what I'd like to do is just start briefly with talking about that first phase of the government's approach to welfare reform around sustainability. When we came to office in 2013, at the time of the GFC, but then also after, the Labor Party had embedded ongoing structural suspending, which was substantially in excess of realistically deliverable revenue. So under Labor in 2008-2009, the yearly welfare bill climbed to be in excess of 100% of the total personal income tax take. So the total of all the personal income tax that was taken in Australia, more than that was being spent each year on the welfare bill. Now, that was a patently unsustainable set of affairs. That figure has now dropped down to 80% of personal income tax is expended on welfare, still a very, very large amount, but getting towards something that looks like sustainability. Across government, the Turnbull government is reducing overall expenditure growth, with real growth in payments in this budget restricted to 1.9%, being down from around 3.5% under Labor. That has been a very challenging task, but that is also a very significant improvement. In the 2018-19 budget, the government will no longer be borrowing to fund recurrent expenditure in the welfare system. So in the year 18-19, we would have reached a point of sustainability where we're no longer borrowing to meet day-to-day operating costs of government, including welfare. I must say, I think that is the single best piece of undersold news for any young Australian. We are actually getting to the point where we're not pushing our responsibilities off onto the next generation of Australians, although there's much work to do. And as was noted, because welfare spending is such a huge part of the Commonwealth budget, restraining welfare expenditure growth has been a very substantial contributor to the fact that we, the Turnbull government, will now join the Howard government as the only two modern governments who've managed to have expenditure growth lower than revenue growth. So the simple fact is that under Labor, the social security and welfare spending was growing at almost double the rate of revenue. So, for instance, under Labor, the growth rate for the job seeker income support part of the welfare system was 13.5% a year, and we've reduced that to about 3.7% a year in terms of its growth. And I hope that I will be doing this correctly. That just shows a couple of the key categories of welfare spending. The red was the yearly recurrent expenditure growth under Labor. The blue is what it is now under us, and the light blue is the projected forward estimates. But you'll see there whether it's job seeker income support for carers, disability support pension, the age pension, family tax benefits. The reality is that this government, and it has been a difficult, challenging and often painful process, has made incredible steps and improvements in restraining recurrent expenditure growth in key categories. This represents the recurrent expenditure growth per year of the overall social security and welfare system. You'll see under Labor that it was nudging up towards 7%. It is right now, under us, under the coalition, come down very substantially under 3%. The dotted blue line is if you add in the NDIS expenditure. So the NDIS as an expenditure sits on top of all other welfare expenditure, but even you'll see there over the forward estimates, with the addition of the single greatest increase in welfare spending in modern history, on top of the restrained expenditure growth, we are still getting things under control. So in total, since the 2013 election across government, the combined savings that the government has made since 2013 have been $150 billion worth. $25 billion of that was achieved since the 2016 election. And of that amount, around $30 billion worth of the savings have been achieved from the social services portfolio since the coalition was elected in 2013. All of that grinding, challenging, difficult and sometimes unpopular work ensures the sustainability of our welfare system. Just take, for example, the measure to save more than $6 billion from repealing payments that Labor said would be paid for by the mining tax, which raised virtually no revenue. Things like the school kids bonus and the income support bonus. The decision to end those payments was, I would put to you, difficult, not overly popular, open to ruthless political point scoring from the opposition, but it was absolutely on any objective measure completely necessary and the right thing to do for the long term of the Australian economy and the Australian people. But a very, very challenging process. So, having made very significant advances in restraining recurrent expenditure growth and dealing with this sustainability problem, what we have turned to in the most recent budget as a government is structural reform. What we've looked at is deep structural problems that exist inside the welfare system and that really have not been tackled in decades. And going back to that idea that if you're going to engage in reform, it's critical to identify with great precision the problems that exist with the present system, I can put to you that the problem identification process has essentially taken 2 years' work by 3 ministers. So I've spent 2 years working with the Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, and Alan Tudge in Human Services. And what we found when we came to really drill down into the welfare system is that the operation of the welfare system was absolutely replete with problems. There was no difficulty in finding problems. They were absolutely everywhere. In fact, there were so many problems with the working age payment system. The real challenge that we faced over the last 2 years was trying to discover all the problems and then understanding their effect, but particularly how one set of problems interacts with other parts of the system and has this flow-on effect of multiplying problems. And the simplest description I think I can give to you of what we found after a long inquiry into the structural operation of the welfare system is that it fails the people inside the system who need help the most. So 2/3 of people inside the welfare system, in the working age payment system, never miss or might only miss one appointment in a 6-month period. 2/3. So appointments like seeing your job active provider, going to a job interview. 2/3 miss only one or never miss an appointment. About a quarter of the people who are granted New Start move off the payment inside 3 months. About a quarter get off New Start in 3 months. About 2/3, 63%, are off New Start in less than a year. So people have this view that New Start is a payment that many are on for a long period of time. Most are offered quickly. What we need to focus on is that group who do seem to stay on New Start for very long periods of time. Absolutely critical to our investigation was the fact that there are a huge number of component parts of the welfare system that were failing badly, and what they were doing was placing stress on the system as a whole. And if no effort was taken to ever make changes, to ever try and fix the broken parts of the system, I think that we were running the risk of what engineers would call cascading failure. And cascading failures usually begin when one part of the system fails and then nearby parts must take up the slack for the failed component, and that in turn overloads component parts and that causes further failures, prompting additional component failures, and you end up in this vicious cycle of failure. And we weren't quite at the point of cascading failures, but there were so many parts of the system that were failing and they'd been untouched for so long that we ran that risk. And of course, when we're talking about failures in the welfare system, They are failures represented by individual human lives that we as a government are failing to take efforts to improve. And again, I think the best and simplest description I can give to you of what we encountered was that the system had basically been putting too many people in too hard baskets and just leaving them there, not giving them any focus, not giving them any of the attention or the sufficient help that they would need. So I'll just provide you with some examples. Whilst I describe that most people will never miss an appointment, about 100,000 people inside the New Start system are persistently missing multiple appointments. And in doing so, they are radically decreasing their ability to gain a job. And the type of appointments I'm talking about are appointments with your job actor provider, turning up to a job interview, absolutely critical things on your path to employment. Now, of those persistent non-compliers, about half of that 100,000 people do not appear, based on our best assessments, to have any real identified issues that would make it hard for them to gain employment. So half of them don't have barriers to employment, of the persistent non-compliers, about half. And that means that for this group, the system isn't sufficiently stringent to enforce the basic mutual obligations of job seeking. So how do more than 40,000 people systemically game the system? The answer is because the compliance system that exists at the moment is fundamentally dysfunctional. Of the 380,000 occasions in 2016 where people missed an appointment without a reasonable excuse, less than 10% faced any financial consequence at all. The present compliance system, what we found, is astonishingly slow. So you will need 12 weeks of inadequate job search before there could be any possible financial penalty applied, and that penalty will often not take effect until weeks after the last failed activity. So there's no proximity between a response and a failure inside the system. And if you have a system where consequence is so far removed from the cause, you are never going to encourage behavioural change, which is what systems like our New Start system are supposed to do. A very good single example of system gaming is the rule that if you have missed an appointment, you can have your payment suspended until you re-engage by going to another appointment. And that process works on a 2-week cycle. So if you miss all your appointments in 2 weeks, you might get your payment suspended. But if you go to an appointment on the last day of the 2-week cycle, you won't have the suspension, so you won't suffer any kind of penalty. And last year, just over 7,000 job seekers missed their appointments and re-engaged on the very last day of the 2-week cycle. 3,100 of that 7,000 people did this 6 times in a year. It's very good having a minister in Alan Tudge who is a management consultant, because he drills down into these things. Those spikes represent the people engaging on the last day of the cycle. Now, when you start to see things like that after 2 years of inquiry into the welfare system, you know that things are going wrong. They've become known as the re-engagement spikes. So 40,000 people of the 100,000 have no barriers to employment but persistently miss appointments designed to get them jobs. The system also fails the 60,000 or so people who regularly miss appointments, and we do have barriers to gaining employment in their lives. And the reason that we're failing them is because we don't engage with them enough, and we don't engage with them early enough and in enough detail. So the new simple demerit point system for compliance that we've designed is meant to try and assist in understanding the barriers to employment faced by those 60,000 of the 100,000 persistent non-compliers. And inside the compliance and mutual obligation system, we're letting people down basically because the system is so excruciatingly complex at the moment and so unbelievably inconsistent that not even the people in charge of it quite know how it works. So at the moment, there are 17 different types of non-compliance events which can trigger 6 different potential types of measured failure. So the simplest design chart we could give of how the compliance system works at the moment is that. I won't leave it up very long because we would need hours to try and unpack how it works. But imagine being inside a Centrelink compliance system, and that is the explanation of how the system of compliance works. In 2014, Patrick McClure did a review of the overarching structure of the welfare system. He noted that there were around 20 income support payments. Each of them have different rules, different taper rates, different eligibility criteria, and the reforms that we are engaging in this budget are dealing with that structural complexity and dealing with the compliance complexity. The structure of the existing system, this is Patrick McClure's best effort at simply describing it. This is the simplified new system. Essentially, we're taking 7 payments, there you'll see on the left, and we are closing some, moving some into the age pension, moving 4 of them into what we will describe now as a job seeker payment. So there is, in effect, one single payment for Australians of working age who are searching for work, and it'll be called job seeker because if you're on that payment, what you are doing is looking for a job. Now, that slide belies some of the complexities in this project, but what it does show is that we are moving to a far simpler system. And as we move 7 payments into one, we're also redrafting to make consistent and coherent all the mutual obligations inside the system, the obligations essentially to search for work. So consider this, an older job seeker is 13 times more likely to find work or increase their hours of employment when they're actively engaged in job search. That is a common sense but measured proposition. And yet, extraordinarily, in our present system, the system is such that someone between 55 and age pension age is not actually required to engage at all in searching for a job. So that's our welfare system giving up on people who are aged over 55. Job seekers between 30 and 49 have significantly lower mutual obligations than those under 30. Makes no sense, and there is no explanation for it that we can find. The system creates groups where the expectations placed on welfare recipients are either too low or completely non-existent. And the enemy to attaining employment in any welfare system are structures that allow for too much passive receipt of welfare. So a very good example is the way in which the system boxes up, ignores, and so completely fails to help people with drug and alcohol problems. In 2010, the number of people who were exempt from the mutual obligations to look for work was 7.7% of the total New Start population. That number has increased 80% to be almost 14% of recipients now. And some of that is driven by increasing numbers being exempt because of drug and alcohol issues. So inside the system at the moment, you can receive a fixed period of exemption from your mutual obligations, or you can avail yourself of a reasonable excuse, if you don't have a fixed exemption, to not turn up to a job interview. And the number of job seekers who are getting the fixed exemption from your mutual obligations because of drug and alcohol use nearly doubled over the last 5 years to be 5,500 people. The number of people who were using drug and alcohol issues as an excuse for not turning up to an appointment, the number of instances that that was used as an excuse, increased 131% in a year, from last year to this year. So that last year there were 4,325 instances where someone was excused from turning up to a job interview because they cited a problem with drug or alcohol. So it's clearly appropriate, and I don't suggest it's not, it's clearly appropriate to have reasonable exemptions and excuses based around drug and alcohol issues. But at present, you can get the exemption or use the excuse without anybody insisting that there's any effort or any plan to address the underlying problem. Failing to insist that an exemption or an excuse based on drug and alcohol issues must be underpinned by undertaking some appropriate and active steps to address the underlying problem means that we, as the government, have simply been knowing about a problem, continuing to pay a benefit and simply moving on and hoping for the best. So we've left people behind inside the present system. That, I think, is a terrible failure to thousands of people, a failure to help them build better lives for themselves. It's consigning too many people to long-term welfare dependency, and it represents insufficient effort to this point from governments. And that is all about to change with this redesign of the welfare system. So if we accept that Australians in those situations where there are problems with drug and alcohol are vulnerable, then the measure of the effectiveness of the system and our value as a society is how much we're prepared to do to help them overcome their problems and overcome the barriers to achieving fulfilled lives and gaining employment. So as part of this reform, we're requiring that exemptions and excuses based around alcohol and drug use should be assessed according to one new additional criteria, and that is a decision taken to exempt or excuse someone must take into account whether the person is actively undertaking available treatment programs or is accessing an available support to address the underlying drug or alcohol dependency. So in effect, we're saying the taxpayer will accommodate an individual in the system and give them an excuse or an exemption if you have a difficulty and a challenge with drug and alcohol, but you have to do something as well. And if you do, we will help you. And we're also changing the rules so that for the first time, treating drug and alcohol issues for all job seekers will be able to be counted as a valid part of your job preparation activities. And that hasn't applied to all job seekers previously. What an astonishing omission in many ways. We're also going to run a limited trial of drug testing. That seems to be the one thing that everyone wants to ask questions on, so I'll leave it for Q&A, and we'll ask questions on that very happily and very frankly. All these structural changes are accompanied by massive investments. But those investments, I've got them up. Those investments, I'll read them to you now. 685 million over 4 years to reduce the impact of drug and alcohol misuse on individuals. 300 million of that is as part of the National ICE Action Strategy. Last year we announced 96 million in a Try, Test, Learn fund to target groups with long-term welfare dependency. In this budget there's $260 million for parents to help prepare them for work, effectively young mums. There's $20 million to help increase skills and experience for mature-age job seekers. There's $47 million that will be spent on people participating more with Job Active Network. And these reforms are not about saving money. They are about saving individual lives, and they involve very large expenditures on the part of government. So look, just by way of conclusion, I might just make mention of a question that we got in the press conference, Alan Tudge, Michaelia Cash and I, when we announced all of these welfare reforms. The question was to the effect that, are you saying if someone is qualified as an aeronautical engineer, they should be content with working in a cafe? Right? And these are the sort of questions that you encounter often. I think there's a specific answer and a general answer to that question. So the specific answer is how content that person may be will depend upon the person, right? So how do they see jobs in retail and tourism or care? I think that they're great, meaningful, wonderful jobs. And also, how does that person use that job as a stepping stone for other jobs that they might desire more? So the contentment of the individual person is, of course, a matter for them. But the general answer to the question, I think, is that being dependent on yourself in a job is always better than being dependent on an unemployment benefit. That's the government's position. It is always better. I think Warren Mundine gave a very elegant description of the evergreen importance of work when he said, dependence is poverty. The only escape from poverty is a job. And there is, I think, a persistent idea inside the social services space that because work necessarily involves costs, travel and preparation, that sometimes, or for some people, it may be, they may be worse off working for an amount similar to what they might achieve through a combination of welfare payments. And that is a persistent theory inside the social services space. My observation is that's an idea that completely misses the point, that many of the most important benefits of work are simply not economic. Humans have always worked, and we did so well before there was even such a thing as economies. And the reason we worked was that we applied our individual capabilities to improve the circumstances of our families, of our wider communities. And before there was even such a thing as real monetised economic exchange, work was, and it still remains in my observation, a sacred form of giving. It's giving by the application of your individual capabilities to some form of greater good, to your community. And that's why work provides depth and breadth to people's lives. When we exercise our capabilities, the first reward that we see inside the welfare system is a sense of dignity, a sense of pride, and a sense of purpose. So when our capabilities are applied to our communities, the second reward is that we get linked into those communities, and forms of social isolation give way to correctness and belonging and connectedness. So work is more than money. It's self-worth from self-reliance, it's friendships, it's purpose, it's a meaning in life. So I'd simply close by saying that all of our welfare reforms are about one simple thing, and that is giving more people more opportunity to grow with the benefits of work. Thank you for your time today.